It is written, I believe, therefore I have spoken. With that same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak. We were born in and we speak with that spirit of faith. The seed of that faith was planted in 1961. It took root during the Second Vatican Council, and it continues to grow and flourish today as our diocese and our parishes respond to the call of Christ and the continuing inspiration of His Spirit of faith.
Welcome to the 6-part Catholic Life television documentary, which celebrates the 50th anniversary of the Diocese of Baton Rouge. We invite you to learn more about our local church, from its historical origins dating back to the late 1600s, to its formal inception in July 1961 with the signing of the official papal decree, to its current Golden Jubilee of 2011. Ours is a story of meager beginnings, exciting evolution, and monumental growth. It is a story of divine grace and human inspiration. Quintessentially, it is a story of the dynamic interaction of a faithful, provident God with His responsive, tenacious, resilient people and community, which we proudly and gratefully call church.
The 1980s in the United States saw the development of the me generation, a generation which splurged, spent, and showed off. In fashion, padded shoulders and teased hair were big in more ways than one. Television pushed the envelope with shows like Baywatch and Dallas, and The Cosby Show challenged stereotypes and assumptions. This decade saw the beginning of the computer age, and the birth of cell phones, MTV, the World Wide Web, and the IBM PC. In politics, conservatism was on the rise with the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States and of Margaret Thatcher in Britain. In the Diocese of Baton Rouge in January of 1983, Stanley Joseph Ott, affectionately known as our Little Bishop, was named the third bishop by Blessed Pope John Paul II. Born in Gretna and schooled in New Orleans until he entered the seminary, Stanley Ott was considered to be a local boy. He had been ordained in Rome in 1951 and remained there to study at Gregorian University until he received his doctorate in sacred theology in 1954. Upon his return to Louisiana, he served at the Student Center at LSU under then Father Tracy, and after the diocese was formed, in many administrative capacities and as pastor of St. Joseph Cathedral Parish. In 1976, Ott was appointed Auxiliary Bishop of New Orleans, where he also served as Vicar General. Upon his return to Baton Rouge, Bishop Ott was welcomed home. He had a unique way of bringing kindness to all segments of our divided population, and he spurred us on to begin our own healing process.
Bishop Ott's selection as bishop and coming as bishop back to Baton Rouge was a welcome change because he had been in Baton Rouge, and many people knew him, knew his work at the LSU campus, at St. Joseph Cathedral, and in the Chancery.
Bishop Ott had worked so many years with Bishop Tracy. He was his right-hand man. Monsignor Ott, Monsignor Borders at the time were both good friends, associates who helped him out a great deal. So when Bishop Ott returned, he was able to just pick up where he left off when he went to New Orleans. But of course, time had passed. It was 6, 7 years later. he was able to begin moving the diocese forward at a real good pace. And people were ready. You know, they had all this pent-up energy, and they were ready to go, you know. And so when he came back, he had no trouble finding people to fill different positions and accept roles of leadership.
Bishop Ott was called back from New Orleans to be a bridging and a healing source for the priests and lay people of our diocese. And he had all of the experience of growing up under Bishop Tracy and also campus ministry and some of that vision, but a very, very healing spirit to him. He came back in 1983 to Baton Rouge. It was a homecoming. He was one of us. He already knew everybody in Baton Rouge, and from the first day he was here, he started visiting.
Bishop Ott, I got to know when he was auxiliary in New Orleans, and anyone who only met Bishop Ott once would know he was the soul of holiness and charity and love. He was a gentle man with a very caring heart and a wonderful, powerful spirit. And he brought the presence of Christ in a very special, unique way by just being with him, as well as dialoguing with him or listening to him speak. During his time, Bishop Ott had many things to bring into balance in the diocese, to try to mediate, and to be a peacemaker where there were some areas of division or conflict. And he did so with patience and gentleness and love.
Under Bishop Ott, the administration of the diocese was restructured. He oversaw the reorganization of departments and of the Presbyteral Council in line with the revised Code of Canon Law, and he called for more effective ministry to the needs of all the people of God. In response, the various departments of the diocese, along with other organizations supported by Bishop Ott, made major contributions towards the goals of religious unity and service.
Diocesan administration took an important step when Stanley Ott became bishop in Baton Rouge in 1983. Monsignor Cage Gordon, who had been Vicar General under Bishop Sullivan and for the first year of his episcopacy, died, and Father John Carville was named Vicar General. Within a year or so, a concerted effort was made through the use of some consultative experts from outside the diocese to devise a diocesan administrative system that would be to the best advantage of Bishop Ott, the persons who were in central administration, and of course the priests and people of the parishes. We joked about it as being something that we wanted to do to let Stanley be Stanley.
Administratively, the bishop's cabinet, so to speak, was born under Bishop Ott's administration. Bishop Tracy, Bishop Sullivan didn't have a cabinet. And so that's significant because it's the administrative way in which we function.
We knew that Bishop Ott rather hated sitting behind a desk. He much preferred going out. He'd attend breakfast meetings, he'd visit parishes, he'd go to ecumenical and interfaith groups. He ate lunch with every politician, from north to south and east to west. And so we devised a structure of diocesan administration that would let him to do that, would free him to do that, without killing Father Carville, who was the Vicar General back minding the store at the same time. It was a very consultative process that allowed diocesan departments a great deal of independence, coordinated through the cabinet of the Life Center and the department heads' meetings occasionally to make sure that everybody stayed on the same page and stayed focused on the mission. Previous structures and offices were pretty much completely redone, in a very, very conscious effort to design something new that would, again, let Bishop Stanley be Stanley. It worked, and still does.
Bishop Ott had lived with Bishop Tracy, as his senior associate pastor. And he had worked with him at LSU as the assistant chaplain at LSU. And so he knew his thinking, very well. And he knew, what had worked well as far as implementing Vatican II, and what had maybe not succeeded so well. So when he came in, he immediately focused on those ministries which seemed to have been problematic under Bishop Sullivan.
Many of the things that Bishop Ott brought to a level of importance while he was bishop were areas that Bishop Tracy was also very involved and concerned about. Just as Bishop Tracy had realized the value and the importance of the Catholic commentator, Bishop Ott also realized that this was a wonderful way for him to be able to communicate to the people.
While Bishop Ott was bishop here in Baton Rouge, there was a lot of planning that went on. The diocese had become somewhat disparate and disorganized, and Bishop Ott saw that. His greatest strength was not administrative or planning strength. His greatest strength was being a good pastor. Everybody loved him, and he was a very deeply spiritual man. So wherever he went, including as Bishop of Baton Rouge, he had a significant effect for good upon the church in that area. He also surrounded himself with people who were oriented toward planning, development, organizing, and I know that a significant amount of strategic planning went on during the time he was bishop and Father Carville was the vicar general. Father Henry Vavasseur was the director of the finance office, so I'm sure all of them participated in different forms of strategic planning during that time.
There was a lot of growth during that time with Bishop Ott. The youth office, diocesan youth office, was founded under Bishop Ott in that they had lay people running it full time, and then it actually even grew as to moving from a one-person office to a three-person office with a secretary, an associate, and a director. And many youth ministry activities grew during the tenure of Bishop Ott. In 1988, I asked Bishop Ott if he would be interested in coming to Colorado for a youth conference. And I was so prepared for him to say no. And, in his Bishop Ott kind of a way, he said, he was famous for saying fine. He would say, fine. He said, well, let me look at my calendar and let me get back with you. And sure enough, a few weeks later, he said, I can't go for the whole time, but I could spend a few days up there with you and the folks that would be going. So Bishop Ott was one of 6 bishops in the whole country who went to this national youth gathering. And I thought, how awesome of a statement that is. Certainly youth ministry flourished under his leadership.
Since Bishop Ott was starting a lot of new programs, one being the evangelization program, he established the evangelization office. With that office came the Renew program. He realized the importance of renewing the spirit of the diocese, the spirit of the people. He knew that the newspaper was going to be a good vehicle for this. Bishop Ott asked some of the LSU journalism professors and students to actually take over the newspaper that summer. And they did it as a project and started the direction of where he wanted it to go, which was focused on the local church, on the people. And he would visit the various churches, and we would take pictures of him with the various church groups so that we were able to say, Bishop Ott really loves you people, and he's there, he's concerned about you. And they were able to see that through the pages of the commentator. Bishop Ott also started his own column. We often laughed and said it was like a travel log. But in his column, he would talk about all the places that he had been and people he had been with. It was his way of being able to communicate to the people.
Bishop Ott had been well schooled in the vision of our first bishop, Robert E. Tracy, as well as in the changes brought about by the Second Vatican Council. He embraced opportunities to further the objectives of the Church in both of these arenas. He was a part of the Greater Baton Rouge Federation of Churches and Synagogues, which was founded in 1986 as a means to bring people of diverse faith, race, and economic status into fuller relationship with God and with each other.
When Bishop Ott was the chancellor of the diocese under Bishop Tracy, he was the first ecumenical officer of the diocese. Ecumenism was a result of Vatican Council II, and we were just beginning to feel our way around after Vatican Council II in terms of mutual respect and working with other religions, other denominations. And so Bishop Ott was the first person in the diocese in the name of our local church to begin reaching out and making these arrangements so that Bishop Tracy could have an ecumenical service with this group, that group. I mean, Bishop Tracy didn't get on the phone and start calling these pastors and the rabbi. Bishop Ott did. He was Father Ott at the time. And so he was making all of these calls, and he got to know the head of just about every church in Baton Rouge in the time he was here. Really, the Catholic Church was in the forefront there because this was part of Vatican Council, that we needed to do that. But when we started doing it, the others started doing it with us. And we had the downtown churches, that coalition. You had the Greater Baton Rouge coalition. It began to grow. And Bishop Ott was really on the ground floor of all of that and helped us move forward with it.
Bishop Ott, we knew him often as the little bishop, brought a tremendous sense of brotherhood and sisterhood to our entire city and to this region. He had been installed a short time before I arrived here to become rabbi of Congregation B'nai Israel. And I knew immediately that he was the kind of person who would emphasize in his ministry a sense of inclusiveness with everyone. He brought a tremendous sense of closeness, of warmth and friendship and fellowship in every sense of the word, reaching out to all parts of our community and to all segments of the population.
Ecumenism was one of the documents in Vatican II, and an area which Bishop Ott enjoyed tremendously and saw a real opportunity for the Catholic Church in Baton Rouge to influence the entire community and to work together with the entire community, because he had great personal relationships with many of the Protestant and Jewish ministers here in Baton Rouge. When he was the bishop, I can remember many, many gatherings that we had at the cathedral, with representatives from all of the other denominations in town. And it was before and after the services, it was like a party almost, or an old boys get together in the cathedral. But the spirit was wonderful. I know just personally, I got to know so many Jewish people in town, so many people who worked in other churches through the ecumenical movement.
He was always very dedicated in his public pronouncements, in his public prayers, invocations, and other prayers to be inclusive in every way possible. And this was especially true when he knew that there would be members of our Jewish community present, so that his public prayer would be the most sensitive and the most aware of the presence of people of different religious backgrounds. That meant a lot to the entire city, but especially to our really quite small Jewish community, that he would be so sensitive in his wording and his language as he prayed in public.
Bishop Ott realized the need for religious education for all persons in the diocese. He urged spiritual renewal and encouraged lay participation.
Religious education became more adult-centered rather than child-centered. Prior to that time, I think a lot of it was simply the CCD programs in schools, and not even in Catholic schools, because the religious classes in Catholic schools were handled through the school offices. In time, though, especially in the early 80s into the 90s, there were two things that took place. The call for ministry within the liturgy and the call for ministry within the parishes began to demand adult education and adult-centered religious education. The parishes began to turn, with the help of a very good religious education department, that began to develop adult-centered courses, certification of catechists, for example. For a long time, CCD classes were taught by any volunteer. During the early 70s and the 80s especially, we began to insist upon certification of religious education teachers. We began to recognize that it wasn't religious education for those who weren't in Catholic schools and religion classes for those in Catholic schools, but it was religious education for everybody. And we tied the two together, and we tied them to the sacraments.
At the Religious Ed office of the diocese, Sister Lydia Champagne was the director, and I was with the elementary school catechesis. A Sacred Heart brother was with the high school. Sister Stephanie was in the office, and we really had a variety of programming to reach out into the diocese and to the various parishes to develop particularly catechesis apart from Catholic schools. That was another wonderful time. We had a bookstore, we had a number of developments of outreach in the diocese.
It's not just education, but it's a formation that includes the educational part, the spiritual part, the pastoral part, the whole life development. Throughout the United States, the programs were beginning to develop in religious formation on diocesan level. We came up with a 12-hour basic curriculum in moral theology, in scripture, in spirituality, in dogmatic theology, and in church history and social justice. And we developed that and then took it to Loyola because we saw a need to get some kind of undergraduate sponsorship. It didn't fit with what we were looking at. So we then went to St. Joseph Seminary in St. Benedict, Louisiana. And through the work there with the rector, Father Scott Underwood, we developed a partnership with St. Ben's and started Religious Studies Institute.
In the 80s, I was pastor in New Roads, so we had Catholic of Point Capee there. But in terms of the CCD class or the interparochial school, I think a big shift was moving from religion classes that were simply academic to religion classes that were also hands-on and experiential. When I was growing up, we had the famous Baltimore Catechism, and it served its purpose. It was good. We memorized answers. So religion class mostly involved memory. In the late 70s, when I was at St. Thomas More, I taught 8th grade religion for 4 years. And we would have the religion class, but we also had discussion in the class. And we brought our religion classes to the nursing home to minister to the residents there.
The Office of Christian Formation finds its roots in the Office of Religious Education. The title back in the 60s when it was founded would have been the CCD office, the Confraternity for Christian Doctrine. And the reason is that the Office of Religious Education, or the Office of CCD, was primarily charged with educating youngsters. The bishops of the country later realized the importance of adult faith formation. In 1987, the Office of Christian Formation was formed. Prior to that, it had been associated with religious education. Richard Machado was our first director. Mrs. Betty Bourgeois, who served our diocese for many, many years, served as the second director of the Office of Christian Formation. The Office of Christian Formation works with adults. The Office of Religious Education, as we had known it in the past, worked with young people. We have both pieces now under the guise of Christian formation.
The mission of Renew was to instruct in the formation of dynamic laity by growing in their own knowledge, formation of small Christian communities, and in parish. We had some 21,000 people involved with Renew under the leadership of the Office of Renew, which I was head of, and the lay leadership of Herman Schluter. It gave us a renewed laity who, being properly instructed, because it was a dynamic program, really awesome in its approach that people loved, because it introduced them to a new formation of their own minds in the Catholic process.
In 1982, the diocese began a concerted effort to offer accredited training for lay ministers, the Religious Studies Institute. I taught in the very first year of it, along with Father Miles Walsh. Most of the parishes in the diocese had laypersons as directors of religious education, catechumenate personnel, on staff as social responsibility coordinators and that sort of thing. And almost none of these people had had formal education in theology and religious studies. And so, in collaboration with St. Joseph Seminary College, we began offering the RSI program to offer to these already experienced lay ministers a chance to get some of the academic background that they were crying out for. It was tremendously successful. In the succeeding 25 years or so, hundreds of people have gone through the program. But that is a hallmark of the Diocese of Baton Rouge. We didn't just want lay involvement, we wanted intelligent and prepared lay involvement. And that's where it can segue, I think, nicely into not just lay ministry, which we depend on, need, and profit from greatly, but the Religious Studies Institute became a prerequisite for our permanent diaconate program. The whole idea of being able to remain a deacon the rest of your life was restored at the Second Vatican Council and implemented in this country in the 70s. With this next class of deacons, the majority of the clergy will be deacons, not priests. These men have been immense help to the laity and clergy of their parishes in serving in whatever capacity is needed. Yes, the liturgical ministry is the most visible, but I think I'm going to state rather emphatically that that's not the most important ministry. The most important ministry is simply being able to help whenever and wherever. And the best deacons do that.
After a short break, we'll learn more about the establishment of the permanent diaconate in the Diocese of Baton Rouge.
Roots of Faith, the history of the Diocese of Baton Rouge, written by Lee Loomis and Renee Richard, former archivists of the Diocese of Baton Rouge and original hosts of Roots of Faith. This beautiful coffee table book explores the history of the Catholic faith communities in the Baton Rouge area from the 1700s to the present-day diocese. With more than 150 pages of history, early photographs of area churches, and present-day Catholic life, you'll discover the rich heritage and culture not only of the diocese, but the individual unique parishes that contribute to its fabric. To reserve your copy of Roots of Faith, the history of the Diocese of Baton Rouge, please contact your parish church to obtain more information on how to place an order.
The permanent diaconate, which existed only on a limited scale in the Diocese of Baton Rouge, was greatly expanded during the 1980s.
The first class of permanent deacons was ordained in 1980, May of 1980, and I had the privilege of being in that first class. And actually we started our studies in 1976, and Baton Rouge did not have a formal study program, so to speak. So Bishop Sullivan sent us to Lafayette for studies, and we used to go to Lafayette once a month for the whole weekend, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. And I'll have to say, that first year was the toughest year that I've ever seen. But when they made the call for permanent diaconate way back in '75, the call went out for men that were interested in the diaconate. They filled the hall up. That was how many people were interested in the diaconate at that time. The diaconate had been active in a number of states outside of Louisiana, and including Louisiana. But for some reason, we did not have a diaconate program, and then Bishop Sullivan made the decision to have a diaconate. It was up to the bishop if he wanted the deacons in his diocese. Of all the men that were in that conference room, they chose 13 of us. And again, I was humbled and privileged to be selected in that 13. The Baton Rouge Diocese made the decision to have their own studies. So the second year, we began our studies here in Baton Rouge. And we actually went to Lady of Mercy, and Father Fry was very much involved in it. And every Wednesday night, the 13 men and their wives, and by the way, the wives were a vital part of the diaconate. We had studies for maybe 2 or 3 hours on those Wednesday nights. And it was wonderful because of the fact Gene Allen, who is Father Allen's father, was in that class of the first deacons. And Gene and his wife Pat used to cook for us every Wednesday night, so that was wonderful.
These men have done tremendous work. And I'll throw a kudo out to their wives as well, because behind every good deacon is almost always a good deacon's wife who is like as not just as active, just as committed, just as supportive of his ministry. We do not train our deacons to run parishes. We do train our deacons to love and to serve and to do so in an intelligent and coherent way. That's what they're very, very good at. And we appreciate them so, so much.
I cannot imagine the church in our diocese without them. How they assist the ministry is indescribable. Their generosity in supporting priests, supporting religious and lay people, supporting one another, is a terrific example and an inspiration to us all. They give their time, they give their effort, they study, they pray, they work, they are flexible for what the needs are, and I just thank God for them. And their willingness to serve and their effectiveness in serving has made a great difference within our own diocese. I know this is true outside our diocese certainly as well. But in our diocese I speak, their contributions are enormous and appreciated.
In 1980, we were ordained. We were the first class But there was a deacon that was ordained before that, and that was Francis Wagasback, who was from the parish of St. James. He went to New Orleans in the studies, and I think Francis was ordained probably in about 1975 or 76. It was prior to us even starting, because he was very instrumental in helping us along the way, and interviewing us and talking to us and so forth on the thing. So in 1980, when we were ordained, it took place at the cathedral. Bishop Sullivan was the bishop, but unfortunately he was sick at the time. So we had Auxiliary Bishop Caillouette, who used to be at the cathedral. He was in New Orleans, and he came and he ordained us. What a tremendous grace it was to us as men. We really wanted one to drop out, to tell you the truth, because we wanted to be the 12 original apostles. No, the 13 men were all so gifted in many ways. And you often wonder why, why the diaconate? Why did they call us to diaconate? Bishop Sullivan was one of the last bishops in this part of the country to determine he wanted deacons in his diocese. And so consequently, when we were ordained, they really weren't sure exactly what they were going to do with the deacons. We're not many priests. We're not glorified altar boys. We have a duty that we should perform, and that they utilize us in that capacity. So we were sent into our home parishes. Father Brew used to make us be present at almost every Mass. And we used to, why, Father? Why can't we just go to one Mass? He said, no, I want the people to see you. I want the people to see just what the diaconate is all about. So it was a great privilege and a great challenge. And I could see the people were not used to deacons. And in my communion line, I could see them changing from my line to Father Brew's line. And I have to laugh, because I told him afterward, I said, after they got to know me, and I'm such a likable person, and so forth, but I could see them moving from Father Brew's line to my line, and he got a big kick out of that. Bishop Ott came. He was very, very pro-deacon. He had Jim Wax as the director of the deacons, and he was very, very instrumental in supporting the diaconate and encouraging the diaconate and promoting it. So we really had a real plus there.
Bishop Ott actively and enthusiastically supported interfaith efforts, and in return, he was loved by the people of all faiths.
Bishop Ott was integrally involved in the formation of the Greater Baton Rouge Federation of Churches and Synagogues almost exactly 25 years ago. And I'm not sure it would have happened as it did happen and as it developed to be a Jewish-Christian affiliation and federation without Bishop Ott, which in those days, and I think to a certain extent even now, is quite unique across America. And that was a huge step for our city. There had been, and still is, the Ministerial Association, but there was nothing officially that reached across religious boundaries in the lay community particularly to form this kind of a federation and a collaboration. And I don't think it could have happened as it did without Bishop Ott. He was hosting meetings, and he was always very dedicated to the concept that it would be an interfaith alliance. These kinds of alliances or federations, associations, are extremely important in the global sense because they remind everyone that we're all children of God. All of us are created, as it says in Genesis in the Hebrew, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that even though we have different pathways and different approaches to the Holy One, we're all brother and sister. When religious officials, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples can all come together in a collaborative way, then it really helps to overcome any prejudice. It helps to conquer ignorance,
and it helps make our communities better.
Bishop Ott's personal dedication to service to all people inspired many individuals to give tirelessly of themselves in service to the community of the Diocese of Baton Rouge and beyond.
You know, St. Vincent de Paul throughout the years has been blessed with such a great gift of the support of the bishops. You know, starting with Bishop Tracy, some of the volunteers that were volunteering in the 60s and continue that today, they share with me what a phenomenal supporter Bishop Tracy was of St. Vincent de Paul and our work with the poor. He recognized, as well as the bishops that followed Bishop Tracy, the fact that serving the poor and the needy is a primary mission of the church. I had a very special relationship with Bishop Ott, and we still have a pain in our heart because of our great love for Bishop Ott. And he meant so much to our diocese, but he meant so much to St. Vincent de Paul. He was a supporter even before he went to New Orleans as auxiliary bishop here in this diocese. And even when he got ill and he was too weak to stand at our dining room serving line, whether it was on Thanksgiving or during Easter, he would pull up a stool and serve meals to those in need because he knew it was so important, the work that we do with the poor. And if you could just see little Bishop Ott there serving those meals, that's a priceless gift that I will share, that strengthened my faith life, that strengthened every volunteer that had the opportunity to witness that.
I do remember the growth of our Catholic related St. Vincent de Paul Society grew a lot under Bishop Ott. So the 80s during his tenure were really times and opportunities for growth. And I remember youth ministry, the Bishop's Cabinet, and the St. Vincent de Paul, these stand out in particular for Bishop Ott.
Bishop Ott encouraged all segments of the population to get involved in the ministries of prayer and service. He challenged all people to live lives modeled on the life of Jesus Christ. He addressed difficult issues head-on and formed committees to find solutions to important problems. Through it all, he was ever present, tirelessly ministering to his people in a sincere and personal manner. Bishop Ott allowed for action and evangelism on many fronts as he worked to spread God's word. Changes in American culture called for new ministries, and the Diocese of Baton Rouge remained on the forefront, developing programs as needs were recognized.
I'm kind of a Johnny-come-lately to the St. Francis de Sales Catholic Deaf Center on Brightside, but it did begin pretty early in the diocese with Father Kenneth Smith, one of my classmates, and the ministry that was down in the Beauregard-town area where the Catholic Deaf Center was at the time. And then he built the center on Brightside and it moved there. But it's, I think, shows the dedication of the diocese to many areas of the social apostolate over the years. I really have been impressed and touched by the hearing impaired persons and their commitment to their faith. And a special dimension of the hearing impaired is a syndrome called Usher's syndrome, which is prevalent in southwest Louisiana, where people are born deaf and blind. And to see a deaf-blind person at Mass as another person is signing through their hands to teach them, to celebrate with them, to interpret the sermon and so forth. It's really, really inspiring to see these persons as part of the ministry there. A group of people from Marriage Encounter that was involved with began meeting in a home in the late 70s, early 80s, where we decided not only that the Worldwide Marriage Encounter was important in having weekends in our diocese, but we came up with the idea of a program in Baton Rouge and in the dioceses of Louisiana that we called We Believe in Marriage Day, centered around February and Valentine's Day. We had the bishops in the area and some of the local political leaders declare we believe in Marriage Day. We had something on the state capitol steps, and we began to develop in the various parishes and even in the Protestant churches in the area a celebration focusing on married couples and summing up the richness of their life in the commitment of matrimony. Well, it only took a couple of years for the idea to develop and reach the national marriage encounter organization, and so it was picked up by them, renamed World Marriage Day, and so since then has been throughout the United States and throughout the world, celebrated, I think, on the second Sunday in February.
My ministry really started as a result of the parish census. The diocese every 5 years used to have a census. And when I went to St. Patrick, the census had just been taken, and I saw how many single parent families there were and how many were caused by divorce. I wrote a letter to everybody who were on the list and invited them to a meeting. Well, we ended up with maybe 15 people. And then the word got around, and the following meeting had about 30. By Christmas time, and we started in September, we had 50 people coming to our meetings twice a month. We tried to make them all realize that this was a transition program, that it was not meant to be a place for them to stay, that they had to move on once they had taken care of the grief of the breaking up of the marriage. And so that's why we used rebuilding in St. Patrick Parish, and then by the time they were a little further advanced, we would suggest that they would go to the beginning experience meetings.
The Diocesan Tribunal deals with marriage cases. You know, what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Everyone here is part 2. Let no one put asunder. But many times when people marry, because of their immaturity, because of problems that they have in their own life, problems in relationships and such, they really aren't ready to enter into a sacramental marriage. And if a person does enter into a marriage, and then later on with that hindsight, is able to see all the elements really weren't there, and that explains why we had such difficulties and why divorce came, then the church ministers to those people by helping them to understand that there's healing and that there's new life beyond it. An annulment doesn't say that a person wasn't married. It says a sacramental bond didn't exist. I had to go through this process before entering the seminary, and I didn't understand it at the time. And dear Bishop Ott was the one who helped me to understand it better. He said I really should do it, and I said, well, I'm not too sure. And he said, an annulment is healing. And I walked out of his office that day thinking, he's a successor of the apostles, and he's a holy man, and if he told me I ought to look into it, then I ought to look into it. And even though it's difficult to bring up all the memories of all the things that failed, and particularly hard to bring up realization that we contributed to the breakup of a marriage, is one of the most times that invites healing. So even though the Diocesan Tribunal hears marriage cases and it's done with the formality of a court, it's really pastoral.
The special ministries in the diocese over the years have been some of the ministry at the very beginnings of the HIV/AIDS crisis, where there was no real outreach and understanding about that illness in the community. A group of people came together through Our Lady of the Lake and Metropolitan Community Church and began to meet about ministry to and a place for persons with HIV/AIDS. At that time, there was a person whose parents were a member of the parish near the airport, and they had a son who was hospitalized at OK Long. And OK Long said, he is not sick enough to remain in the hospital. We would like to release him to some kind of a home or hospice. His parents did not want him at home, and there was no nursing home in the whole state of Louisiana that would accept a person with the AIDS virus at the time. So Lady of the Lake began to put together some funds. A family donated their home in the Sacred Heart area, and Lady of the Lake opened St. Anthony's Home. It later, through their ministry, continued in a program at the hospital and perhaps some ministry at their complex out near the old airport and mall. So Lady of the Lake really was a pioneer in HIV/AIDS ministry. A number of the parishes in Baton Rouge would fix lunch and bring it to St. Anthony's Home and would minister in that way in that area. Along with the very early history, the time of my second appointment at Sacred Heart, I became aware of the same-sex orientation of many persons and Catholics in Baton Rouge, and some people approached me about a ministry to gay and lesbian persons. And so there was an informal ministry that began. We connected with some of the very early history of a national group called Dignity, and participated probably in the third chapter of Dignity in the diocese. Developed into a relationship with parents and family, and the beginnings of an interfaith group called PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, in Baton Rouge. As the years went on, the Dignity group kind of fell out of favor with the U.S. bishops, so we began a more independent diocesan ministry, which later evolved maybe about 6 or 8 years ago into DBR Hope as part of our family life apostolate in the diocese.
When we return, we'll discuss changes to the liturgy which took place during the 1980s.
Roots of Faith, the history of the Diocese of Baton Rouge, written by Lee Loomis and Renee Richard, former archivists of the Diocese of Baton Rouge and original hosts of Roots of Faith. This beautiful coffee table book explores the history of the Catholic faith communities in the Baton Rouge area from the 1700s to the present-day diocese. With more than 150 pages of history, early photographs of area churches, and present-day Catholic life, you'll discover the rich heritage and culture not only of the diocese, but the individual unique parishes that contribute to its fabric. To reserve your copy of Roots of Faith, the history of the Diocese of Baton Rouge, please contact your parish church to obtain more information on how to place an order.
The 1980s were a time of development and maturing of liturgy in the Catholic Church.
In the 1980s, what happened in liturgy was, as a church and as ministers within the church, we became comfortable with the new liturgy. When the liturgy changed in the late 1960s and early 70s, the immediate that became apparent was it's in English now. And the priests face the people, and some lay people are involved in terms of commentators, lectors. And we had to get comfortable with that. The responses and music, and it wasn't Latin, and you don't look at the missal and you don't pray the rosary during Mass like you used to do, or it's more involvement. And it took us about 20 years to become comfortable with that. It took the priests, for example, time to become comfortable with themselves, facing the people and dealing with the English language. It took time for us to have lay people formed in ministry so that it was not just you get up and read the scriptures, but what is the meaning of the scriptures? How do you do the readings well? Eucharistic ministers, extraordinary ministers of communion. What's the reverence? What is the personal interaction? It took us time to become comfortable with that. And I think that began to happen in the 80s. And as we felt comfortable with what we were doing, both ordained and those who were lay, we began to develop a spirituality of the liturgy, a reverence for the liturgy, an understanding of the liturgy.
One of the things about Catholic liturgical life is that there is renewal going on often. Liturgical reform and renewal continues to happen. So the lectionary, the text of the lectionary, the new translation occurs. Again, another edition of the Roman Missal is given to us. The Church is trying to better understand how do you translate from the Latin into the vernacular, and what's the best way of doing that. There is a process that was used where you got as close as you could get to the original Latin text, but you did it in such a way that it expressed in the language, the vernacular language, the meaning of the text. So it wasn't literal, but it was faithful. But it wasn't perfect. And so during the 80s and 90s, I think there was a growing sense that there's some maturity coming to mind here in our understanding of what these last 30, 40, 50 years have been since the Council. The conciliar renewals continued, but I think there became less and less an appetite or a push for reforms. What I think I saw was more of a centralization of the renewal effort coming from the congregation in Rome, as opposed to the bishops' conferences taking the lead in this area. And I also sensed that there was more and more a sense of uniformity being looked at, being desired when it comes to both the words and the ways in which Catholics worshiped. Some would have said, and some did say, that during the period of the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, the sense of the liturgical reform and renewal diminished. I think I would say more that, again, organically, the Church is trying to be faithful to our tradition, and to do so with the best sense of pastoral care, and offer us, we who worship, still with our understanding of what the Constitution says as those basic principles.
The music began to be developed. The music began to be written for the new liturgy. It had taken off in the 70s, but we sort of got in the beginning like the Damians and the St. Louis Jesuits, and that was mostly sort of with guitar accompaniment and a little bit other accompaniment. In the 80s, we began to get full orchestration. We began to get what happened in the medieval church. And so the music became fuller and more complex and more reverent, more expressive. And I think too with the St. Louis Jesuits, for example, they were sort of the forerunners. The music became more scriptural. It became a full body liturgy. And the intricacy and the choreography of priest, deacon, Eucharistic ministers, readers, hospitality ministers, yussiers, decor, that was something else that developed locally too. Again, out of LSU, Dr. Makita Mock. Her degree was in art history and taught art history. She went up to Notre Dame and got a degree in liturgy. Dr. Mock has written several books about liturgical art and environment. And so environment became a part of the liturgy, and we paid more attention to what do we say about color and texture and where things are placed and what do books look like and what does the altar look like. And that began to have an effect on our architecture, on our churches. And that's become noticeable in the churches that we've built in recent years.
Bishop Ott's varied abilities and energetic work were recognized by the bishops of the United States, and he was elected as one of the delegates to the World Synod of Bishops in Rome in 1987, which was charged to discuss the role of the laity in the church and in the world. But in 1991, our beloved bishop was diagnosed with inoperable cancer. As he grew physically weaker, his continuing good cheer and ongoing ministry were truly an inspiration. The holiness of his life touched the lives of all who met him.
Bishop Ott is remembered in this diocese so fondly by so many people. As time goes on, we realize even more the energy and the wisdom that he had. He was able to touch the people at a very important time in their lives when they were hurting very deeply. I think also, too, for those who knew him, one of the legacies that he will always have is showing us how to die. We knew for quite some time that he had terminal cancer. He lived much longer than the doctors had predicted. Death is something that most people really don't want to talk about, they don't want to think about. And I think he showed us how to die with dignity and with love. And I think that that's one of the legacies that he will have left us.
All of us who remember him would first remember that person, that wonderful human being that he was, and that how he showed us how to live. And then when he was diagnosed with the liver cancer, through that process, I believe it was about a year and a half or so, he showed us how to die. And I can remember coming and visiting him when he was in the hospital. And before I could ask how he was already asking me, well, how are you? And I would say, well, Bishop, I'm fine, but the question is, how are you? And he always was upbeat about that. And he, along with the other bishops, have left us a great legacy.
Bishop Ott's greatest asset was he was a truly holy man. And I used to joke a lot, but it's one of those jokes you tell but as a joke, but you somewhat believe it. I used to say that he had a guardian angel on each shoulder. He would do things that most administrators would fear to do because they would be setting a precedent they couldn't live up to, or those kinds of situations. But he would do them because a Baptist preacher wanted them, or the rabbi wanted it, or the mayor wanted it, or whoever. He was a man who almost always said yes, but he never got stung by it. And it was wonderful. I mean, it worked. I think he would be remembered as, a holy person who could make the really good side of religion a great blessing for the whole city.
Bishop Ott left a legacy in Baton Rouge of a ministry of person-to-person caring. He would visit anybody in the hospital. He would visit anybody's home, especially if there was some crisis or some need for the consolation of the church. He would also add to your joy if you were having a celebration, he didn't mind showing up and adding to the life of the party. My own personal experience, one of my sisters was married here in Baton Rouge while I was overseas. He told me he'd take my place, and he showed up at the wedding and the reception. Another example, when we would have occasional priests' parties, I remember one occasion up at False River. We were all at somebody's camp, and several boats were out on False River, and people were water skiing and playing volleyball. And at one point we talked Bishop Ott into climbing onto an inner tube and getting pulled behind the boat. He only weighed about 110 pounds, I think, and he was bounced around pretty severely before he finally fell off in a wondrous large splash to the cheers of all of us. He wanted to have fun with everyone else. He wanted to magnify our joy. He wanted to magnify the care and concern of the church in times of challenge, and he knew that doing that meant personal contact. Yes, he was all in favor of programs like Renew. Yes, he was all in favor of big solemn celebrations of liturgy like the Chrism Mass, when you could get people together and worship in a formal way. But what most people realize is that that man showed up everywhere, tirelessly, and gave witness to what it was to be a follower of Christ. He did so to his dying day, never shying away from reaching out to people. Some of the most poignant stories of him reaching out to cancer patients and people who just lost a loved one happened when he had lost his hair from the chemotherapy and he could barely move himself, but he'd insist on being put in a wheelchair and roll down the hall because someone else needed a pastor.
When he died and his body was laying in state in the cathedral, one evening service was dedicated as an ecumenical service. The vigil service was not the normal vigil service you might have for a Catholic funeral. It was an ecumenical service. And we had representatives of just about every church, synagogue in Baton Rouge there. They did the preaching, they offered the prayers. It was a beautiful tribute from the interfaith assembly of Greater Baton Rouge.
I leave Baton Rouge now to go back to God. God who is so good, and whom I believe as we fulfill the golden deeds in our own life, each and every one of us, they will come to a rich harvest in the eyes of God, where the scripture says so beautifully, the just shall shine like the sun. That is my wish for myself and for all of us, that what are we doing now to make our community better will have a lasting impact upon our own lives and upon the lives of all our people. And so I say, thank you, Baton Rouge. I love you, Baton Rouge. God bless you, Baton Rouge.
As the Diocese of Baton Rouge mourned the death of our beloved bishop, the people put their faith in God to guide them.
As a rabbi, I certainly think the idea of faith on the part of the diocese, and that it's born in the spirit of faith, is tremendously important. In these days of a very difficult and challenging economy, we have to be people of faith. And the diocese, which represents a majority of religious people here in the city, with a tremendous majority of Catholic people here, thank goodness, can have a very leading role in helping to inspire and to lift the whole community. As a Jewish person, I understand the diocese to continually be reaching out in a matter of faith and trust and love toward people of other religions. And I think that's a very important characteristic for our whole city.
And I would only offer a prayer, as Bishop Ott would want us to, a prayer for our whole community. It's in the book of Psalms, a beautiful verse that he knew, Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad, which translates as how sweet and how pleasant it is when brothers and sisters can come together in unity. That would be my prayer, that we would always continue in a fine, loving, compassionate relationship under God's guidance and doing our best to honor and to love one another.